Have like a few quick disclaimers I want to offer up into this space. The first is that we did a lovely land acknowledgement, which I appreciate. I am joining specifically from the traditional homeland of the Shawnee Nation, Miami, Wyandotte, and other indigenous nations. So I want to acknowledge the land that I am coming from in central Ohio. And also want to say this is kind of an odd way to facilitate this dialogue, right? We'll be doing it in a webinar format where we're going to be really leveraging y'all using the chat box. And whatever nonsense Abby and Vernon and I can come up with. So please, 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 for the sake of all of us, participate throughout. Really, this is designed to be a really engaged dialogue and not so much an information share, in part because I am in no way an expert on this topic, right? I am learning just as much as the rest of you all. I still identify as a pretty young professional or pretty new professional. But this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about really since our world stopped, for lack of a better phrase, back in March. And I did what I think a lot of people did and spent the summer consuming just about everything I could, every webinar, every podcast, every article. Special shout out to the Leadership Educators podcast and then Priya Parker's podcast, Together Apart, which were two things that were really instrumental for me, as well as a great LeaderShape conversation on virtual events that happened this summer as well. So I think there's been some really good standouts, but just want to sort of throw that out there that this is more an amassing of knowledge from lots of great smart brains and also a lot of failures and things we've tried that haven't worked. And so really want to just sort of craft this space as a space where we can work together. And yeah, I will absolutely put those podcasts in the chat as well. But a space where we can work together to talk about what is working, what isn't working, what could be going a little bit better in terms of how we are structuring those virtual facilitations. Before I do that, I have just a few sort of like overall talking points or notes that I want to hit, and then we'll get into more of that discussion space. But first and foremost, and I think this is something that is almost so simple that sometimes we miss. I think it's important to note that a strong virtual facilitation is not just translating your leadership facilitation over Zoom, right? So it's not just taking that PowerPoint and that facilitator's guide that has been tried and true for you for a while and just popping it over Zoom and figuring out like, okay, I'll do this swap for this swap. I think it really starts with taking a step back and returning to our learning outcomes or our primary goals of the activity, and then building our content, our processes, the tools that we use around that. And so also want to acknowledge that that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. So myself, along with what I would imagine a lot of you, that may mean that you are working on maybe a reduced capacity of the content that you offer up. Maybe you have a menu of like 20 workshops that your team typically has available, but you've only been able to adapt 7 to 9 because it takes brain space to do that in an effective way. But want to acknowledge that that's a lot of work, but it is important to make sure that you're starting with that goal in mind and working around that goal rather than just popping your curriculum into a virtual space. Part of that, again, is that pre-planning and then integration of tools is so key to start. And I'm using Zoom here because Zoom is what Ohio State uses. You might use Zoom, you might use Teams, you might use Google Hangout, you might use one of the 17 other platforms that we are all now living on. So please just use Zoom as the shorthand here for virtual platforms for facilitation. But that pre-planning and integration of tools is key. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of those tools. I think we know that pre-planning is important anytime we approach any sort of leadership facilitation. And also, I know that I do this and someone else on this call may also be guilty. There's some things where it's like, yeah, I've done this a bunch before. I can probably pull it together as I go. We get a lot less room to pull it together as we go whenever we need it to have planned in a virtual space. So I think that pre-planning time, really making sure that you're giving yourself that is really key. And then there are just some activities that do not work virtually. Like there's just there's no virtual version of a human knot. It does not exist. We're not touching each other right now in any way. And that's okay. But there are some things that only work virtually, and that's fun and exciting too, to be playing in a new playground for some of us. Some of you all may have been doing virtual facilitations for years and be like, yeah, this is not new to me. But for a lot of us, we know that it is new, or at least in different ways. And some other just like thoughts to keep in mind as we're working through this. Access and inclusion always need to be at the forefront as you're thinking about that planning process. I know for me, I think that this has been a bit of an access wake-up call. So things that we've sort of skated by in terms of particularly thinking about those who might be visually or auditorially impaired, or mobility pieces that we're working on getting better about, but I think that sometimes those traditional leadership workshops can be a little bit behind in terms of how we're considering bringing everyone into the conversation. We're now having to do it due to ADA requirements, which is fantastic, and I'm glad that we are, but I think really making sure that along with your outcomes is at the forefront of everything that we're talking about. And we'll go into a little bit more of that as we move along as well. And then sort of these last two things that I want to think about before we get into more of a discussion place is that virtual spaces allow us to attempt new and interesting facilitation techniques, right? I think that we are all, or at least I know that myself and my team have been functioning from a place of how do we just get this done because we have to get it done. And I want to encourage us as we are maybe finally starting to take a breath going into the end of this semester. Also considering our virtual world as a space of play and possibility and trying new things that may or may not work, and learning from that. I think that we have sort of this amazing gift in that we've never done it before this way. So it's okay if it doesn't work every time,
Mhm.
but not being afraid of that and instead really holding on to it. That being said, there are some things that we know we want to make sure that we do in a virtual space that we might have not done in an in-person space. Things like shortening our time, right? Like Zoom fatigue is something that no one talked about before 6 months ago, and now it's the only thing anyone can talk about. But how can we shorten the time that we're asking of our participants? And how are we doing that in different ways, right? So not only shortening the time of the actual workshop or facilitation, but also how are we integrating pre-work? How are we asking people to bring thoughts to the conversation, right? Like how are we making that time more bang for your buck so that people are really spending time interacting while they are on those calls together? There are other things that we want to make sure that we're doing that are new and unique to that virtual space as well that we can get into more in just a bit. And then finally, and this is something that we can get to at the end, that I just want to throw into the mix here, that all of this knowledge that we're accruing is not in vain. It is not just to get us past the everyone has a vaccine mark, right? Like we are learning new things that don't go away. And personally, I don't think that we're ever, quote unquote, going back to whatever things looked like pre-pandemic. I think that virtual learning, hybrid learning, a space of possibility for programming has widely expanded for our higher education landscape. Whether that makes you happy or not, I think that that is kind of where we are. So I also want us to think about only if not only for our sanity of like, oh my God, I'm spending this many hours trying to figure out how to redo this in virtual world. That knowledge is not going to become irrelevant in whenever this goes away. I'm not going to say a specific timeline because I don't want to jinx anything. um, but also that that's okay, and that we don't want to throw away this knowledge and that it's valuable there. So those are some like off the top of my head thoughts as we're coming into a discussion about virtual facilitations. But would love to just sort of open up the chat. And before I do that, I'm going to put the name of those podcasts in the chat so that I don't forget to do that.
Yeah.
um,
And Anna, as you're doing that, I thought I would share too. I know that I have a sister who's an educator, and she's so not in this leadership educator space in higher ed, but more with K-5 art students. But she started using the separate camera where her students can see her hands and see what she's doing, and she's like, "Oh, this is." I never would have thought that this is something that I needed to use. And now, even when I'm back in my classroom, this is something that I'll use. So for students to be able to see directly what it is that she's doing, she's like, I'm seeing how much more they're learning and growing through that to be able to see the tactical work that I'm doing. And so I think that that's a small example perhaps of the ways in which we're discovering those new ways to work that will continue to work well once we're back in person environments.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think something sort of similar there is I've never seen people be this excited to do an icebreaker activity. Like they're just so desperate to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm trying to really capture that energy to actually interact with other folks and like
Yeah.
how we can recapture that as opposed to the eye rolls that we might normally get in a in a different time in a different setting. So how to capture sort of that same enthusiasm of framing this as like, this is a connection moment, not a like quote unquote silly fun activity that we're
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love icebreakers, but I agree with you that we're
Yeah.
looking at those a little bit differently now. So that's helpful.
I have my orientation leader shows through anytime I lead an icebreaker, but
That's an important skill. So
yeah.
thank you for sharing those podcasts in the chat. I think that's really helpful. I love that Priya Parker one as well, but I haven't listened to the other one. So that's a great one to check out.
Yeah. And Vernon, if you wouldn't mind advancing to that next slide. Beautiful. So I would love to get us started from a space of positivity, because it's something that, though I am very anti the cult of toxic positivity, I think we could all use a little healthy dose of right now. And I'm curious, go ahead and drop in the chat, y'all, what has been going well for you in terms of facilitating in virtual spaces? What have been successes, and like big or small, whatever that looks like? Becca talked about way more participation. We
Mhm.
have also seen that as well, which has been really fun and interesting, and not exactly sure exactly how to analyze that, but um, I'm going to try and read some of this stuff out as it comes in, is just sort of speak y'all's great voices into this space. But I think we using reactions, right, is
Mhm.
amazing. Sort of thinking more about the participation. I don't know if that, Becca, you specifically meant numbers or just like engagement in the conversation. Something that my brilliant grad student who's also on this call, who I'm going to embarrass right now, and I talk about a lot, is just the beauty of the chat function and how that has enabled particularly internal processors
Yeah.
to participate in ways that they don't normally get to in an out loud conversation. And so that has been really exciting. Um, yeah, having student led community building icebreakers, right? Like getting our students out. We get to work with a great team of student leaders who lead our workshops, who are like, what is going on right now, but have been doing a great job in leading some of that dialogue. It's going to go, we're going to see it a whole bunch, but breakout rooms, breakout rooms, breakout rooms. I think the more time we can spend in breakout rooms, and really anything that we can do to deconstruct, we did a really good job of moving away from that sage on the stage notion in our leadership educator world. And then all of a sudden, we were spending all of our time with a screen share and one person talking into a box. And so I think using breakout rooms to really talk through something that I have found that I really like about breakout rooms. I know that some people like to pop into each breakout room to check in how the conversations are going. For me, that just does not work for my style, which is fine. I've liked to empower each breakout room to pick someone who's going to report out on the discussion, which at least provides a little bit of accountability of one of you is going to have to share something. So spend at least some of this time that we've given you talking about the thing that we asked you to talk about.
Mhm.
So if you are not someone who likes to pop in, that's a tip that I like to offer up there. But yeah, I think using reactions to engage in different ways is amazing. Um, and just the value of increased participation, introverts participation, um, using that chat feature is really, really amazing. Um, I saw in here, Benjamin talked about this, working at a school that is multi-campus allows for more outreach and more connection, right? We had the same exact experience. Ohio State has 6 campuses, and we were able to connect with all 6 of them over the course of our leadership week this fall, which is something we've never had the opportunity to do, which has been really exciting. I'm sorry if I'm missing some of y'all's great comments too. I'm just trying to offer in as much as possible. Um, there's also some great mentions of some tools, which we're going to get to in just a bit. Things like reactions and polls, but also like Mentimeter, Jamboard, those sorts of things.
I see Jamie's comment too about using those applied improv trainers too, which I think is a really great idea.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Becca also has a point in here, right? Like we've noticed that students are there because they want to be there. So that's led for
Mhm.
really meaningful conversations. Um, I think something that has been interesting for me about our virtual spaces and our virtual world is that we've been able to increase the capacity of our meeting rooms without losing intimacy because we're
Mhm.
sending them into breakout rooms in a way that feels more manageable. Like if you were to ask me to stand in front of a room of 80 people and try to lead one of our, like a true colors workshop, for example, like there's no way we're going to be able to pull this off, but it works using some of our virtual tools and the way we've structured that. And so that has also been an awesome resource too.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then pre-work, right? Like integrating pre-work, anytime you can have them do any sort of reflection. I think the one thing we keep hearing from our students is that they don't want to spend any of their Zoom time doing something they could have done off of Zoom, right? So even if you previously had them take an assessment or an instrument in the workshop, go ahead and have them do that ahead of time. I know that there's risk associated with that because they might not do it ahead of time. But I think integrating pre-work wherever possible or any sort of reflection pieces is fantastic.
Yeah.
What else are you seeing here, Abby, that you want to call out?
I think one of the other things that I saw, that report out, I think is really good. I see Jasmine's comment there about using that report out, just asking people to do that. Is that during a Zoom meeting, Jasmine, or perhaps afterwards? I don't know, Ben, this new program that you listed there.
Yeah.
That integrates with Zoom. I don't know that one, but being able to make that virtual meeting more interactive, I like.
Yeah.
That's great.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Thanks for
Um,
that link too, Ben.
yeah. Yeah, I think report outs are something we do anyway from small group spaces, right? Like that's not new for us, but I think
Mhm.
really using that, and given if you're worried about time, you don't have to have someone unmute from every space. It could be a report out into the chat, right? There's a way to still do that in an effective way, but still make sure that people are sharing back.
Mhm.
So that being said, I love hearing all of these successes that you all have had. I also, again, want to reinforce that we're doing weird stuff in a weird time. So I am curious, what challenges have people been facing when it comes to facilitating in virtual spaces? Benjamin, no,
Yeah.
yeah.
That,
Attendance,
yeah.
participation, attendance. Yeah, feeling confident to read the room. That's a huge thing, right? And I think I struggle going back and forth between wanting to respect why people might have their cameras off and also really needing people to turn their cameras on if they can.
Yeah.
So I've really cultivated my phrase of like, there's a lot of reasons why you might have your camera off. It's if it's just because you don't want it on, if there's any way you'd consider turning it on, that's really helpful for me, right? Whatever you can do there.
Yeah.
But it is so challenging, right? And the attendance question I think is big. I know, especially as we're thinking about everyone facing a lot of budget cuts too, some of those incentives that you might have had to offer for why people were participating in programs may have also had to get cut in a budget cut world. And so that's definitely, I think we have tried to streamline our content and offer less in the hopes that there's more people in those things, but also, yeah, the participation bubble has been wild. Um, yeah, cameras off, not using the chat. I think something I want to offer up here in terms of this participation when they're in the space itself. Um, I think this is when really using norms at the beginning of a conversation can be super, super critical. Like I know that we do norms at the beginning of so many of our conversations in our workshop spaces. But something I've thrown out there is, hey, I'm going to expect you all to talk as much, if not more than I am. So just brace yourself that that's going to be what we do in this space. And otherwise, we're just going to chill awkwardly as we wait to pull that through. It doesn't always work, but at least you're preparing people ahead of time. Um, but that's again why I think using those breakout rooms and small groups with then report out and just say in the breakout room, someone needs to be willing to report out, then you're guaranteed to have X number of people who are ready
Mhm.
to report out and to share. But yeah, it does absolutely, it makes it hard to not feel like you're lecturing as opposed to um, really facilitating, which is the gig we want to be doing, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm seeing a lot here about fatigue and about just sedentary environments too, which I think is interesting as well. And I wonder what it is that we could do to potentially encourage movement and motion as a part of our conversations, right? Do we have a 5-minute break where it's like, please get up, dance around, stand up, or like if whatever's accessible to you, move from your space. I think that those are all things, but also then this is also where it comes down to how can we shrink the time that we're asking people to be engaged so that that fatigue doesn't wear out in exactly the same way.
I was just thinking about that too, Anna, that I think oftentimes when we're asking people to be really intentional about how they're focused with us during those virtual events, and then when they have a break, they're using that time to check their email and check, right? Like they're just looking at a different screen or looking at a screen for a different reason. But if we can be intentional about those breaks, like this is a stretch break, this is an outside break, this is a water break, like being intentional about how we set those breaks up for people or asking them to get outside as they can, I think is so helpful. Look at
Yeah.
something a little further away.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share this in a bit, but we've developed a guide for virtual icebreakers and team builders that we've been using on our campus that I'll make available for everyone. But a lot of them actually have people get up and move around their space to find something, right? Just for the sake of getting people moving and active. I've also found that like I have never dedicated more time to just straight up icebreakers at the beginning of a conversation to get people talking. I'm like, if I lose 10 minutes of information time, but you'll actually participate in the 25 minutes I have left, then that's the trade-off that we're going to offer up. Austin has a really great point in here about a call to deliver more programs to keep
Yeah.
students engaged, and students not wanting to participate in more programs. Like they're zoomed out, but we keep hearing make sure they're having a meaningful experience. We want to retain our students. There's definitely a disconnect between maybe university expectations and student expectations, and then sort of sitting in the middle. I don't have a solution to that. I just wanted to speak that out as something that's very real and relatable
Mhm.
and approachable. Um, there's also some interesting discussion on sort of multiple sides of this coin in the chat right now. Um, about the world of asynchronous learning, right? And like having a recording of a workshop versus um, having people participate, right? Like I think there's something beautiful about our ability to now have access to asynchronous conversations. And we are also not, it's not the same, right? Like it's not the same as engaging in a discussion and in a dialogue. Something I know that we found is like we love the value of asynchronous learning. I'm being able to offer that to our colleagues with the caveat of like, please make sure that you're dedicating even 5 minutes to doing a reflection with your students later, right? Like if we couldn't make it work to do it in person, then please make sure that there's some sort of synchronous active discussion here so that you're not losing that piece.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. So many things here, y'all.
I know this is.
Um, so I want us to, as we're thinking about overcoming some of those challenges and also some of those things to go well, spend a little bit of time crowdsourcing tools that are allowing us to make these virtual meetings really valuable. So I'm going to do what is potentially a wild thing, but also something that we all do now in virtual world, and drop a link to a Google Doc in the chat. And I'm going to encourage you all, go ahead on there and just drop in tools that have been valuable to you. I've tried to at least start our list off. I also have on here a second list that's just facilitator guides and other resources. So if there's things that you wouldn't necessarily consider a facilitation tool that you want to highlight, go ahead and drop it there. I included the link to Ohio State's virtual icebreakers and team builders guide there so that you have access to that. But I'm going to give people just a couple of minutes to jump in there and see if there's anything else that you want to add or links that you want to add, and then do some report out and read out of what comes through there. But I wanted to make sure that at least this part of the discussion lived in a physical place that y'all could take away from.
Mhm.
I know sometimes so many good ideas come through in a chat or in a workshop that it's hard to capture it all. Hard to remember everything that we heard that was smart and interesting.
It's a lot being added to this document already. That's great.
I know, it's awesome. I also I know that it's been like this for years, but I'm obsessed with the Google Drive anonymous weird animal names as the anonymous user.
It's a bizarre function.
It truly is. But you know what? It's distinct, and I know exactly what's going on there. They've
Yep.
got a brand.
Yep.
The animals that Google assigns brings a special kind of happy, like the blobfish.
A quagga. I don't even know what a quagga is.
No. I mean, they all must be real from something. The best part is it is someone's job to go find a running list of animals that can be used here. Amazing. So I'm going to give people probably another like 30 or 45 seconds, and I'll start reading stuff out, which does not mean to stop adding it to the chat. But if you can add it to the bottom of the list so I don't skip it, that would be great. Yeah. Okay, so some tools that people are loving or some tools that people are using. And some of these are Zoom specific, some of these are general. So just gonna sort of throw that caveat on there, right? Kahoot, which I think is something that we were already using in different capacities, right? But it is like a live polling trivia application. I think it's fun because you get really that competition aspect too. So you could have people in small, like have who maybe they were in a breakout room together for the icebreaker, and now that's their team for the Kahoot challenge, right? In a way to continue to foster community and identity building, while also trying to make sure that people actually were paying attention and retaining some of the things that you were saying there.
Yeah.
Teams, as well as now Zoom and a couple other Microsoft products, are offering live transcription. Google Meet does this as well. So it is definitely great to have those transcription services available. I do want to note that a lot of those are not fully ADA compliant. So while they are a really good step, it's also important to be considering all of the closed captioning options and other accessibility options that you may want to consider in there, but we do love to see that. The annotation tool in Zoom. This is something that you have to go ahead and enable it as one of your special settings, but it's nice because it allows you to have people actually draw on the screen. So it's a way I have seen it used as like, here's a spectrum, please place where you are on the spectrum. Or someone in the notes said they use it for a four corners type of activity where they actually physically place themselves on those spaces. And I think that's a great use of that annotation tool. It's a nice way to sort of solve the problem of there's no other way to make this work in a virtual space, and I really want to not lose this activity. Poll Everywhere is a polling tool, as is Mentimeter. There's a couple others out there as well. And then we've got quite a few different virtual whiteboard platforms that are mentioned here. So things like Miro, Mural, Padlet, just using a shared Google Doc like we're doing right now are all great resources.
Right.
There's some really practical things in here too, which I appreciate. So things like just using music during downtime or quiet period, the fact that we can still screen share our audio is something that I've tried to do quite a bit. And I actually, whenever I send people into a downtime or maybe a time where they are doing an activity or a silent reflection, have encouraged people to go ahead and turn your cameras off, mute yourself for this moment, and then we'll turn them back on and engage. And I think giving people that built-in break is really nice as well. The Pear Deck plugin for Google Slides, I've heard a lot of great things about. Factile, which is a Jeopardy-like game creator. Kudo board, which is a way to give shout outs to others. Flipgrid does video-based discussion boards, which is awesome, especially if you have that retained group. There's some other things in here, AirMeet, Rocketbook, Quizzes. Ooh, I love this. So if you have an intact group, create a running playlist for the class or the team or the board and let people add to that collaborative playlist and pull back to that. That's a really fun way to do things there too. So I will leave this Google Doc obviously up and active so y'all can continue to add things, but I appreciate y'all spending some time sharing tools and resources, right? I think sometimes it can get overwhelming, right? There's almost so many great virtual tools out there that it can be hard. So I also want to just throw in, find the things that work for you. It's okay if you don't use every tool. It's okay if your leadership educator friend who you really respect loves something and it just does not work for you. But absolutely want to make sure that that option is there and available to you all, and play around with some stuff. I think if maybe fingers crossed you have a little bit of downtime in these coming weeks. Maybe just go through and play around on different websites and see what's available for you as well.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So Vernon, if you wouldn't mind going to that next question, just for the sake of our time together. So I am curious. I started to talk about this a little bit earlier, but this is again something I'd love for you all to share in the chat if possible. How have you had to navigate issues of access and inclusion differently in virtual spaces? I know I mentioned some stuff earlier around really trying to actively ask for access needs, using captioning tools wherever possible. Um, for me, I'm also really struggling with the fact that when I'm in person, I'm able to sort of do a scan of some more visible identities, and are some more people with certain visible majority identities taking up a lot of space in conversation. And if people are black squares, it's hard for me to tell that in the exact same way. So that's something that I've really tried to figure out.
Mhm.
Something really practical in terms of access and accessibility, right, is always send the call-in information for whatever platform you're using, right? There's a lot of people who may need to call in. They may not be looking at a screen, whether that's Zoom, Google Meet, Teams, etc., for a lot of different reasons. So I think making that available to people, whether that is from an ability standing need, or maybe they're a student parent who needs to be giving their kids a bath time. Like one of my students has bath time during our cohort meeting every week. So she's never on video for that reason. So there's a lot of reasons why that may be necessary.
Yeah.
I know sometimes we just do the shorthand quick link, but make sure to give that whole information whenever possible. Yeah, always including a section in registration about asking for access needs or accommodations. And I think this is a good practice to have. This is something else we want to continue into the after times, that we, even if we didn't do it in the before times, these are just the times. I have no descriptive word for them other than the times.
We learned kind of early in this virtual cycle that we're all in about just thinking about how students often only have one screen, whereas you and I perhaps are looking at two different monitors to kind of spread our documentation out over a virtual meeting. And so being able to think about how do we provide that guidance to students to be able to say, like, you can minimize your chat window for now, or you can close your manual for now, just to be able to think about how to keep them from doing all those visual acrobatics while they're trying to participate in your virtual session.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, right? Like there's no norm too small to not offer up to make things more accessible to people. I think when we're thinking about how to invite people in, and I think you all did a great job in modeling this in this discussion today, right? Like not only what are we going to do in this conversation, but how can you use the tools that are in front of you right now to make sure that it is meaningful and
Mhm.
valuable.
Yeah, thank you.
Other thoughts in terms of access and inclusion? I like that's a whole other conversation, so I don't want to skate over it, but
Mhm.
I do want to say, like, we can't forget it. And I do think that that accessibility piece with add-on tools, I know that Michelle mentions this in the chat too, right? Like we're all pushing tech to a place where it has never been before.
Mhm.
And also want to reify that a lot of the things that we are now doing is stuff that the disability community has been asking us to do for a really long time. And so I'm glad that we're getting on there in terms of actually practicing universal design wherever possible, actually practicing accommodations wherever possible.
Mhm.
And much like everything else, we got to try as hard as we freaking can, and we're going to fail a few times too.
Sure. Anna, we discovered specifically with Jamboard, but I wonder if some of these other tools are like this too, where there's a limit to how many people can be in that tool at once. So Jamboard has, I don't know what the number is, but maybe like 35 people at a time can be using Jamboard. And so that meant that some of the participants were getting booted or were not able to access it. Do you know about that with some of these other tools that are listed here?
Yeah, I know that, for example, like Poll Everywhere has a limit for the number of responses that can be offered at different points.
Mhm.
I think that a lot of places, the free version may have a pretty set cap on
Yeah.
it that we don't always know about. So I think that's something important to explore. And like, is that a possibility for all of your offices within your department to collaborate to like purchase maybe the not free subscription to something?
Yeah.
There's a couple good points in the chat that I want to offer up there too, right? Like, and I meant to mention this earlier, so thank you so much, Jamie. Describing visuals, making sure that you're never saying as you see on this screen, right? For a lot of reasons, they may not be seeing it. Yeah, and it's helpful outside of disability, right? Like maybe the video's lagging, maybe they're just called in, but making sure that you're always describing whatever's on the screen as well. And then Austin asked a great question about how people are managing accommodation requests in a virtual environment. So what partnerships have you created? How have you revised previous standard practices? I know for us, we were given some pretty great guidance from our Office of Disability Services in terms of language, but we are definitely having to change the timeline of our RSVP processes to make sure that people are going to have enough time to request accommodations and that we could meet those accommodation requests given that timeline. So while we might have previously had people signing up all the way up until the day of, we're having to ask for a week in advance. And so we're having to promote things sooner as well.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate Jasmine's comment too, just in asking those people what works for them, just being able to make that connection with people and see how can this be most successful for you to be a part of.
Absolutely. Okay. Again, I don't want to shortchange this conversation, so feel free to please keep engaging with it in the chat. But for the sake of time, I want to move us forward to that next question. What have people done in new and interesting ways? Like, is there something that you're really proud of that has been new and fun for you in a virtual space that you might not have been able to do in a traditional facilitation?
It's a great question. Sure, lots of people are furiously typing their responses to this one.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, starting a podcast.
Starting a podcast. I was waiting for it. I was like, someone's going to talk about podcasting because it's been great. And something else that I've seen, so there's people who've been doing intentional podcasts. I've also seen people doing a like 5 or 10 minute quick hits out of a recorded workshop. So they've turned that into the podcast. So rather than doing separate content creation, but like pulling the highlights from a workshop to make that a condensed podcast too.
Becca offers a great pivot here from doing a in-person potluck to doing a cookbook. I love that.
That's so fun. It makes me hungry even though I've already eaten lunch. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I really love that.
Yeah.
That's great.
We've seen a lot of success with Grabandgo kits for different activities on our campus, right? We've been, I'll say we're hybrid. We really haven't decided what word we're using to describe the state of ICE. Most of our programming is virtual, but a lot of our classes were in person. So we'll go with hybrid. And so we've seen a lot of success with having grab-and-go kits available so that you can still have those supplies that you might have previously offered up.
Yeah.
And then it's cool because like students have something fun to take home with them too, which is a nice giveaway there.
That's terrific. Sorry.
No, go for it, Abby.
I was just thinking not having to factor in travel costs. I hope that has been a valuable factor for some folks as well.
Yeah. I think the trick too, though, is sometimes we don't factor in because now there is no travel time. And so all of a sudden I see myself with like back to back meetings that I never would have done in person. But yeah, not having travel costs, allowing students to get access to you in different ways. Yes, Jasmine, does it feel relatable? Just giving ourselves 5-minute breaks. I've been a big fan of scheduling a 45-minute meeting as opposed to an hour-long meeting just to have it in there. Oh yeah. It's easier to involve alumni on things. That's a great point, right? Like it's easier for us to reach folks. We're able to get guest speakers or panelists that we might not have been able to get to. We might have access to more things, which is great. I also want Jonathan has a video interview series on what the word is leadership. Um, that I'm gonna copy the link to this YouTube and put it on that shared Google Doc just so that we don't lose that.
Okay.
Um, I'm also going to put those podcasts that I mentioned earlier on that shared Google Doc as
Yeah,
well.
good idea.
Jonathan, I'm really curious about this
Yeah.
about this video interview series.
Okay.
Great. Um, And then sort of just the last question I want to offer up, and then we'll see if there's anything that other people have for the group today, is what do you think this year of virtual facilitations might shift your programming, or how it might shift your programming, even when we do go to a new quote unquote normal?
Mhm.
Although again, I don't believe that that word exists anymore. So what are you all taking with you moving forward?
It's such a good reflective question, I think, Anna. And it almost feels like the silver lining to what we've been going through, right? These last couple months, and being able to think that there has been some good things to come out of this, and being able to think about being so intentional about making sure we are connecting with other people. And so I really appreciate this question as a nice reflection over the year so far, too. So I see Michelle's response here, and other responses are starting to come in here, too.
Yeah. Yeah, I also realize that this might be a hard question because we're not at the end of the tunnel. We're still very much in the middle of the
Yeah.
tunnel. And I'm asking you to think about the edge of the tunnel, but like roll with me. Yeah, so we've got a lot about more hybrid opportunities, more recordings, and allowing asynchronous participation. Um, yeah, having in-person events moving forward, but offering a virtual capacity as well.
Mhm.
Um, love not being on campus until 8 p.m. Absolutely, right? Like
Good for you, Michelle.
there are now some meetings we could ask for students to do virtually, because
Yeah.
9:30 might be the only time that works for them, but at least I'll be at home in my joggers,
Mhm.
and not in the union.
That's right.
Um,
Colby's comment here about the yes
yes,
and.
and
So I
yeah,
appreciate
which
that.
we love a yes and mentality. Thanks,
Yeah.
improv. Right? This idea. I also, something that I have found to be really valuable that is maybe more philosophical and less practical right now, is we had some good conversations on our team about we're not going to be able to do everything we do because we only have so much capacity to do what we do. And we're also being asked to do other things like
Mhm.
supporting quarantine and isolation housing right now. Um, and I think that's allowed for some really good reflection on quality over quantity in terms of our programming that I hope that we hold on to, and really revisiting those outcomes in our goals, not just like, well, this is the thing that we do, this is the program that we do. Um, something else that I want to offer up here, right? Like a lot of people are shouting out, right, incorporation of technology. I think this is something that we've been moving towards in our leadership educator world, and we just sort of got catapulted there. And so, however we're sinking or swimming, right, like holding on to that and really using this as a moment of innovation and the value that's there, um, is fantastic.
It is.
Yeah.
I like that. Courtney's comment here too about um she doesn't use this wording, but almost being forced to be more flexible. And we're almost right. We have to kind of analyze those programs that we've been using for so long and so many in such specific ways. And now being able to say, what other of these tools could we use? What other methods could we use to incorporate to engage people, and to think about if they are still virtual, then how can we do this differently? And I think this is a good time to reflect on that.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
also think something that we've seen happening more than maybe we might have previously is like we're asking our students what they want right now because we have no data to tell us what we want, right? Like we have some amazing data people who are getting data to us as fast as we can, but it's not like we can fall back on 20 years of assessments here. So
Right.
we're just having conversations with them and designing programming about what they're saying. And
Mhm.
that's a really great habit and practice for us to be doing that I want us to
Mhm.
hold on to as well.
For sure. I really
Um,
appreciate that. Good.
Well,
Yeah.
those were our guiding questions for today. Abby.
Yeah, Anna, this is so wonderful. And I feel like this Google document that you've shared with us has become such a gift to all of us too, and being able to collaborate and think about the ways that we're working differently and the tools that we're using that maybe are unknown to other people. So to be able to kind of crowdsource those opportunities of what's working well and to share that in such a helpful Google document feels like such a gift to everyone. So thank you for creating that. That feels like such an inclusive and wonderful thing to do, which feels like such an Anna Wagner thing to do. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
uh, I
Oh,
want to.
sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just want to thank everyone too for actually engaging and participating. Abby and I were talking beforehand, and we were like, it's gonna be real odd if no one wants to talk in the chat because there's no tips or tricks here. There's just questions. So thank you all for having the answers to the questions and helping facilitate each other.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is such a good way to bring people together to talk about. I have questions about what I could do better here, and I've got ideas that I've been using that I think are effective. And so to be able to have this kind of sharing of ideas with everyone over the last hour has been really valuable. And I agree that chat window has kind of been blowing up this hour, and I really like being able to read about other people's ideas and just see how they're sharing what's working well for them and kind of some struggles as well. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to everyone for engaging with us over this hour to be able to talk about, as leadership educators, how are we doing this and how could we do better as a group too? So thank you for engaging with us in that. You all know that we do still have two more of these programs throughout the rest of this week, tomorrow and Friday as well. So if you're able to join us for further discussions on what leadership educators are doing this time, we appreciate it. And then as part of a small commercial interruption, I just want to be able to share with you too that LeaderShape has 4 programs that we have available to folks. So some of you have come to us to know through the Institute, through our flagship program, but we also offer Catalyst is a session that you can do on your campus with small groups of students in person if you're able to. Resilience and Courageous Dialogue are both virtual, both in asynchronous models and then synchronous as well for resilience. I flipped that. I'm sorry. They're both synchronous, and then we have asynchronous versions of resilience as well. See, even using these new terms is kind of tricky and getting used to how we talk about things.
Absolutely.
But thank you all for joining us today to be able to talk about this topic and to remind ourselves when we should mute and unmute, as well as how we participate in virtual programming. So thank you so much for bringing these ideas to us, Anna, and for guiding us through a really helpful conversation. I appreciate it. And everyone have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, folks.
We absolutely can divide the world into who waves in a Zoom.
Yeah.
I think that's something I'll continue to bring into an in-person experience, to still wave at meetings.
I have never waved or thumbsed up this much. Like so much of just this.